Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. For this video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild adventure Sharn, the Missing Schema, designed by Elven Tower, aka Derek Ruiz, for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shoutouts to my platinum patrons Andrew, Brian, and Richard, and gold patrons RPG Papercrafts and Charming Grenade. Thank you all so much for your support. So Sharn is all about Eberron. Sharn is a city in Eberron. What is Eberron? Eberron is a fantasy world designed by Wizards of the Coast back in, I believe, 3rd edition time, I think early 2000s, and it became pretty popular for a while. Nothing ever got as popular as Forgotten Realms. That's always been the biggest one. If somebody associates a world with Dungeons and Dragons, it is the Forgotten Realms. But Eberron is cool. It is like it's a fantasy world taken to the extreme, and it is a like steampunk or maybe like arcane punk with like magical trains and this entire race of like sentient iron giant type golem type creatures. It's very interesting. There has not been very much support for it. And as much as I love Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, Wizards has done almost everything just on Faerun, and even then almost specifically on the Sword Coast, with some few exceptions here and there with like Chult and Ravenloft. They just recently finally put out a book, I believe tying in A World for Magic the Gathering, Ravinka. But Eberron has got nothing. Warforged have been added, I think maybe through Unearthed Arcana, but there hasn't been anything. So people that love this fantasy world and love other worlds like Greyhawk, or like Dragonlance or something, have had not a lot to work on, and that is where the Dungeon Masters Guild comes in, and I think Sharn does that really, really well. Essentially, it really serves as a wonderful introductory adventure, and you can see right there it says introductory adventure, designed for player level 1 through 5, and it is scaled, so every encounter has the scale from between a party of level 1 characters up to a party of level 5 characters. But it does a good job of introducing this world via this very unique city, which has some cool properties about it and includes a very, very neat sequence that you would not be able to see in a city in the Forgotten Realms, which I think is important. If you just have an adventure set in Eberron that you could easily just take out and put in the Forgotten Realms, that is a lost opportunity. But I think this does a good job of actually showing off Eberron and why it's interesting, why it's worth exploring and playing. And I just think it's well written and well designed, formatted particularly. I really like the way the art and the flavor text and everything else is put together. So let's go through Sharn, the Missing Schema, and see what it's all about. As I mentioned, it is a level 1 through 5 adventure that scales well for all those levels. It's hard to make an adventure for level 1. It's very hard. I've reviewed level 1 adventures before, and it's very tricky because you can't do much, given that the players, have the power of a wet paper bag. It can be very hard to scale for that. What it does here partially is it gives you a potential fairly powerful party member that the party could take with them, which you could have that be a way to scale up encounters, or at least have maybe a party that's not, doing well or super combat inclined. You could maybe have this party member join them in a more permanent capacity as a helpful ally, which is nice. But I think it can work pretty well. There's a few sequences that cause me to raise my eyebrow about if level 1s could handle it, but I think it works out pretty well. All right, let's go through. So the introduction does a really nice job of explaining, and again, use the official material as a baseline, which this does. It says, okay, let's go over like what it means to be the Dungeon Master and what it means to play a group. Like, how do you even do this? It says read the module once or twice, take notes, do all that. So it's very much treating the DM as somebody that's not only new to Eberron, but may even be new to tabletop role-playing and D&D in general, which I think is important to have this in there if you are labeling your product as an introductory adventure. If you use that phrase, that tells me that that is welcoming new players and new DMs. Whether or not they are, then that's fine. They know that they can just skip this or nod their head along. But I think it is nice and important to have this on here. There's actually a big sequence on the Warforged, because that's probably one of the more unique things about Eberron, is this entire race of Warforged and what they're all about. Oddly enough, it goes specifically into the fact that they are genderless, and that throughout the adventure, the author writes them as a they, which makes perfect sense to me. And then, oddly enough, it has this in there, and then it says, as a DM, you're free to use this or disregard it completely. But then every instance of using they to refer to a Warforged is italicized, and that actually distracted me very weirdly. I kept on saying, like, they, I emphasized it in my head when I was reading it, and I was like, oh, wait, that's just saying that. It feels weird to point that out here and then also have to italicize they every single time. This part's fine. I just felt that italicizing they every time that's very nitpicky. And then, new to Eberron. Unfortunately, the best thing it does is basically just tell you to go to the Wayfinder's Guide to Eberron, which is another product on the Dungeon Masters Guild website, which is fine. I mean, this is an introductory adventure. It's not meant to explain all of Eberron to you. It is meant to give you a little bit of background information, and specifically it tells you about Sharn, which is the location that this adventure takes place in. The entire location takes place in a city, which, given that the most recent official Wizards of the Coast product was Dragon Heist, which also takes place in a city, I think that's perfectly viable to have that, to have an adventure be able to take place in there. And Sharn is a neat enough city where you can have plenty of different things happening and make it really fun. Even include some dungeon crawls and some chases and all this really neat stuff. There's notes on making an adventuring party, and a lot of these are kind of general DM notes. One of the things it mentions is like, hey, before starting the game, ask the players why your group is together, why they've banded together, because people often make their characters in a vacuum, and maybe they'll have background ties that have to do with whatever they've been going on with their own lives. But then when the party comes together, it's like, okay, why are these 4 or 5 random strangers of probably wildly diverse different backgrounds and skill sets, why did they come together? And one of the tips it says is, 2 characters are childhood friends, 2 characters share a dragon mark, which is a thing in Eberron. They're relatives, or they're just one character owes money to another, one character saved another's life. And I did this in my Tomb of Annihilation campaign, by the way. I did create some of these connections, and I think that's it's a very effective tool that I would straight up use as an ongoing, like if I made a general DM advice, definitely do this, and it's really fun to see this here as just another form of general advice in an introductory adventure. Create those connections between players before you start. I think it helps create that nice connectivity between players and gives them a reason for being together. There's a chapter on the adventure primer. It's got the nice list of important NPCs, which is, it's just very, very well organized. You got your adventure overview that breaks down exactly, okay, what is the plot, what happens in each act of the plot, what is a schema, which is the MacGuffin that they're after, although this is an important thing in Eberron's lore, are these just magical blueprints, because again, it's all about this technological renaissance that this world is going through, that also there was a war in the past, and people are trying to collect these. Knowledge is king here, and it is, for the purpose of this adventure, the schema is just a MacGuffin. It is the item that people are trying to get, and that is just a classic trope that is classic because it works. It works very well for adventuring. Like, adventurers have to get a thing, and the thing itself doesn't particularly matter. But it is nice that it is a thing that is a thing in Eberron, and it's important here, and it is explained very well. So we break it down, and adventure hooks, also good to have. The adventure hook is the reason that your characters are going on this specific mission. So they could be like a nephew of the quest giver, or just hired mercenaries. They're not too complex. They're not so much that it's not like the Lost Mine of Phandelver, where like there's multiple backgrounds everybody can take that ties them into the plot, which I would recommend doing something like that if you wanted to have, if you were creating characters specifically to start this adventure. But that, like the nephew of the professor one, like that's a good one, and that ties into a really cool moment that happens later on that would create a more emotional impact if a character was related to or friends with this quest giver. So I would definitely encourage that one. So part 1 is just getting the quest, and there's a lot of information on there. There's a lot of background. It's very well written about explaining the city of Sharn, which is this really nifty. Let's see if I can scroll. Nah, it's not gonna be for a while. It is a city of towers, and it is literally these towers stretch miles into the sky, into like the elemental plane of air or something. And they've got like sky rails, and people get on these like floating discs and fly around between. I mean, it's just like this Jetsons like sci-fi city in this fantasy world, which is an amazing visual. And the adventure absolutely takes full advantage of that later on for sure. As my wife, because she always calls me while I'm doing a video. This first part is just them getting the mission. That's it. They're just learning about this mission that they have to go into basically the sewers or depth of the city, retrieve this schema for this professor, and bring it back. That's it. Seems pretty easy, right? And again, there's a lot of nice background information about Sharn. I do like the fact that all these little knowledge type skill checks, like history, there are different levels of information that players can learn depending on how well of a roll they make. So, for example, that everybody knows is no matter what they roll, they get that information. If they roll a 14 or if they roll at least a 14, they get this information. If they roll at least a 16, they get this information. So that's pretty nice because they just get more. And it's all flavor text. None of it is actually like actionable intel, but it's just cool, I think, to have that in there and kind of reward players with that much more information if they roll particularly really well on knowledge. And some players are built particularly like that way. If you can't tell already, I also really, really love the artwork and the formatting here. I love that we get handouts, which there are all separate handouts that are included in the purchase on the DM's Guild. The actual bounty contract, which serves as the kind of inciting, like, here's the mission. Sharn Sky Coach looks really cool. And I believe the Elven Tower, Derek does the artwork. So most of the artwork and handouts that you see are actually done by him, which is really fantastic to see. I really respect map making cartography so much because I've looked at so many things that just use that kind of Adventures League style of just black ink kind of written on there just as a bare bones map, and I really like a nice visual map. That's my style. Like, I respect people that can play Theater of the Mind, but my style is put a map out there, let people ogle over it, and move things around. In my case, it's on Roll20, so it's all doing that digitally, but I really, really love having some quality maps on there. Look at all this information here. Just a ton of, and all of this yellow box is stuff that you're, as the DM, telling the players. It's almost too much. I'm not going to complain about having too many words in a DM's Guild for sure, but there is a lot of the DM sitting there and like introducing you and describing this city to you. It might be a little much. You don't want to have like too much of a cutscene, but I am certainly guilty of that. I definitely like hearing myself talk. You get more information on the professor, who's just a normal academic who's just trying to learn more about these schemas. I believe financed by one of the rich hoity-toities from the upper ward, and it's very obvious, like, set up. The richest people live at the top, the poor people at the bottom. The commentary is just baked right in from the beginning. There we go. There's the map I was looking for. That's an awesome looking map. So there you can see there's a skyway up here, literally in the clouds, and then there's the towers divided up into different tiers. And then the depths of the underground, the cogs. And look at this really cool handout you get of the map. Now, this is not a map that I could really use for battle map purposes, which thankfully, well, there is one encounter. It would have been nice to have like just a random sewer encounter, but frankly, I can use literally any map for that. I can just throw just a square of some kind of grimy stone and throw the tokens on there. That's not a big deal at all, so I'm not going to fault it for not including the map. But this is a really nice player handout you can give, and it's really flavorful, too, to actually get this nice little map on parchment with the lines on there, and like, all right, here's the map to the thing. Like, oh, okay. I think that's just a really cool addition. Part 2 is the actual, like, dungeon crawl into the depths, which is basically these 3 parts, which the third one is the actual dungeon. The first part, they meet with a shifter wolf character, which shifters are a race in Eberron, who I'm not sure if they actually can shapeshift. I don't think so. They just take on maybe the characteristics of those animals. In this case, a wolf, long-toothed shifter. And it's just the typical like gang thug, gangster. Down there with pet rats because it's the sewer. And he tries to extort the players, pay me and I will escort you safely to your destination. And of course he's got his buddies waiting in line, so if they do pay him, then he just leads them into a trap. This one worries me a little bit because just looking at the stat block for this Longtooth Shifter, again, if players are level 1, they fight, ideally they fight him separately, and then they fight his buddies, which I think there's 2 of his buddies, and then like 1 rat. But this guy has 21 hit points, multi-attack, and his attack is a +5, and his bite attack can knock people prone. That's a lot of shit going on for a CR half monster. Like, I haven't looked at the monster manual to kind of compare what other creatures are about this time, but that seems pretty powerful. It seems like at least like a CR1 style creature. I mean, he's definitely stronger than a bandit with that many hit points and multi-attack and a +5 to hit. That's pretty strong. So I feel like if this guy does successfully get them into that trap and the player level 1s have to fight 3 of them, then that's painful. Here's an example of adjusting the encounter, which I really, really love. This will definitely be in a pro at the end of my review, is that straight up, how do you scale this for levels 1 through 5? This is how. Like, you adjust the encounter, you add, which in all of these situations, it's basically just adding more of a certain kind of creature, although in some points it does say, like, max out the hit points of these creatures, too, to make them more dangerous. So, level 1 as written. It seems very, very painful, but if the players can do it, they get past this little gang of sewer shifters and their rat friends. They meet up with this Warforged, which is cool to include a Warforged in there. I feel like if people were creating characters for Eberron, somebody would probably create a Warforged because they're really a neat like robot race. Very much like the Iron Giant concept, where it's like they were built for war, but the war has ended, so what is the purpose of these creatures, which I think is always a neat thing to explore in a lot of like AI, sci-fi type fiction. In this case, in fantasy. Bloody Spear is their name. And it doesn't have, or I should say they, I guess, they don't have a whole lot of notes about role-playing. They seem like just kind of a normal Warforged, kind of neutral-ish, out to just make money. They meet them out. The players meet Bloody Spear outside of the door, and Bloody Spear cannot make it past the door, and they have created a replica of the thing that the professor wants. The professor originally hired this Warforged to do the mission, and the Warforged never returned, wasn't able to do it. So the players actually encounter this Warforged, and essentially, depending on how it goes, they can either recruit them or just let them like walk away and try to sell that forgery that they made or whatever else. But this is the potential NPC the players can get. Just kind of a nice little role-playing opportunity for the DM to get a chance to play up the Warforged. Maybe I would have wished a little bit more about role-playing notes. I guess there are 2 paragraphs, and then they have like a bullet list of things that this character knows, which is nice. Or the player could attack them, but apparently Bloody Spear is equipped with a ring of displacement that lets them basically turn invisible and run away, so I guess they're not meant to be attacked. And then the laboratory is the third part of part 2, which is a miniature dungeon crawl, which is nice to see. And by the way, the maps here, obviously looking at this, I automatically love this map. Let me scroll, you can see it, there we go. It has a DM version, separate DM version, a separate players version, and a separate Roll20 version. Holy crap, I am so thankful for that. Thank you so much to the Elven Tower for making all these excellent maps. I appreciate it so much. As somebody who constantly has to put lack of good maps on as the cons to reviews for adventures, that is not a con here. The maps are absolutely fantastic and should be like the gold standard for how to do maps. Again, I'm not asking for anything like super incredibly amazing, although I think these are very, very nice. I don't expect Mike Schley quality in terms of detail and high resolution, but I do just want nice maps that are functional, that I can put the tokens on and have like little visual details on it. You can see the schema right there on the table, and then there's VATs built up. I think that's really, really effective and nice. And there's various creatures in there. There's treasures. I think it works very well. The very ending has when they find the schema, then it like summons up these Zendric homunculi, which are these creatures that are amalgamations of various mechanical things. There's a lot of mechanical traps in here because it's a tomb of sorts for this laboratory, which is very nice. They get the schema, they turn it into the quest giver, and then part 3 is a surprise chase sequence. The adventure's been pretty linear up till now, and Part 3 is the one cool, interesting twist. They turn in the schema, they get the reward, they essentially think they've completed the, fairly interesting but otherwise very straightforward adventure. They just went, the city itself is a cool backdrop, but they just go to the sewers, do this thing, and then go back, and then they're done. Like, all right, that was a quest, I guess. They're leaving the quest giver's office, and they see a bunch of thieves break in and steal the thing that the players had just returned. The thieves get that. They wrestle with the quest giver, the professor character, stab the professor in the gut, and then race off with the schema, jump on this sky ship, and then start flying through the air, which is a pretty awesome visual and a fantastic sequence of events, and really shows off how interesting this city and this world is, given that it's such a vertical structure. You can see the friggin' awesome artwork here. The idea here is the characters are obviously supposed to jump into full hero mode. They are meant to go, oh shit, we need to go help. And of course, the professor's like, oh, you gotta, he's been stabbed in the gut, and his buddy's coming up to try to heal him, and you gotta save him, we can't fall into the wrong hands. There is a sidebar that if the players are just like, all right, well, we did our job, we got our money, or whatever, then they could technically just drop it. I would imagine most groups wouldn't do that, but I appreciate that there's a sidebar note that like, oh, if the characters do escape, then essentially this written adventure is over. Sorry, your players are shitty. It doesn't say that. That's what I would think. And then here's kind of what happens in the lore, which again is outside the scope of this adventure. Your players are supposed to jump to the opportunity and say, oh, well, let's hunt these thieves down and go after them. And they are meant to essentially go to the nearest way station, because apparently the thieves had like a feather fall spell and were able to essentially escape even though they were nearby you and get away to where you can't just follow them on foot. And they jump on a sky ship and start going. You go to the nearest, whatever they're called, these flying stations, and jump on your own little raft. And in these soar sleds, which are these just basically flying surfboards or skateboards they just get on and fly through the city and create this really, really interesting chase sequence that seems absolutely incredible on paper, and then I'm just trying to picture how the hell would I actually run this, and I feel like there needs to be just a bit more structure. And it even mentions, like, there's no map for this encounter, use theater of the mind. It's meant to be two characters are flying together on a sky raft while the rest of them are flying on soar sleds of one each, and the purpose of this adventure is not so they can catch up to the enemy. It's so that they just simply follow the enemy the whole time, and then that main ship kind of shoots off their own soar sleds of the thieves, and then it becomes this kind of aerial battle. And the only real note on here is that every time somebody takes damage on a soar sled, then they have to roll a successful acrobatics check, although I don't think it actually says what the DC is for that, oddly enough. It just says successful acrobatics check. Yeah, I don't actually see that written, so I'm not sure what the actual failure point is, but essentially they can fall. And if they fall, there is an entire sidebar here, falling in Sharn, of essentially a D20 list of options that can happen, because this city is built with this infrastructure in mind. Like, people travel via rail and via the sky all the time, so falling is not necessarily a uncommon occurrence, so things can happen. And some of the crazier things, like a giant owl can grab the characters, or a magical bridge appears, as they do often throughout the city, and somebody can land on that taking either less damage or even like no damage, or a mage just walks by and casts Featherfall on you. So those are interesting options, although it essentially takes that character out of the fight. So at that point I would want to wrap things up, because anytime you take a player out, that's definitely a bummer. It doesn't actually mention what the successful dex check is, and I don't think it would be a dex check. Wouldn't it be a dexterity saving throw? If you avoid falling off your thing, would probably make more sense. I wish there was a bit more structure here. I get that it's very difficult to structure a chase in general. Those are kind of always going to be theater of the mind, but I still wish, like, maybe it was like okay, here's what happens over the course of 3 or 4 rounds. Like, round 1, everybody closes in, there's enough for like ranged attacks. Round 2, people start getting into melee range, but these two stay back and do ranged attack. Round 3, try to play it by ear, have the players be able to respond, but I need more as a DM besides just, okay, here's a chase sequence, good luck, DM. I really like the concept here, but I would need a bit more structure and instructions about how to run a chase sequence through the air when people can use 3 dimensions and circle around each other and do all this craziness. Although I do really like the concept here. what's meant to happen is whenever you want it to, essentially they reach the warehouse. The thieves reach their destination, which is this warehouse, which has mounted ballista on top, which shoot at the characters, and it's meant to make the PCs back off and approach from land. So as a DM, you'd want to, and it even says on there, the way you need to approach this, you're sitting ducks against the ballista. One good hit will be enough to destroy any of your flying devices. So that is as close as a DM as the flavor text is going to get for the DM literally telling the players, hey, you're probably not supposed to approach this via the air. However, again, there's a sidebar that says if your players are either higher level or they've just done things particularly well, everybody's pretty healed up. If they're just really brazen and crazy, then they can just take their things and fly over into the warehouse if you want them to. They'll just have to survive, several rounds against the ballista just firing at them. Which again, unfortunately, if you lose a party member at that point, they would fall, and then that would get pretty dicey. So it's interesting that option is there. I guess particularly for higher level parties, that would be a really fun option to be able to crash. It reminds me of our Storm King's Thunder campaign when we crashed into a ship, but we were like level 10 at the time, so that was an option that we could take. If you were a party of level 1 or 2, you probably want to just back off, get yourself a short rest, and then go in on foot. Which leads us to part 4, which is the warehouse, which is basically just a one-room dungeon. There are a little bit of side rooms, mainly full of loot, but essentially, and again, a really cool map here. Essentially, it is just this one big warehouse room where you meet with the villain, Artemis DeKenneth, and he gives the players kind of an ultimatum where he's, the classic talkative villain, and he explains that, if you can join him for whatever reason. They don't really know him from anybody else, so it's kind of it's a bit of a half-baked moment. I mean, it's interesting that it's there, but then unfortunately the adventure doesn't actually include any aftermath options if the players do accept. Like, the best time that there are choices to be made is when those choices are meaningful in the adventure. Like, they lead down different paths, or they lead to one fight, not to another. Those feel like meaningful choices. This one, as written, isn't a very meaningful choice because you either fight this final battle or you don't. And if you don't, there's not really any information on how to handle that. You just like, okay, yeah, we'll work for you now. And then the adventurer's like, yeah, that can happen. But there's there's nothing like the authorities don't come and try to arrest all. Like, I feel like there should have been some kind of event there that leads to at least some kind of climax or ending that's not just you can agree and join this crew now because there's no real, like, the adventure doesn't really support that. And it mentions, like, this outside the scope of the adventure. Like, okay, well, at least give me something that happens afterwards. Otherwise, again, what's supposed to happen, the players are meant to be more heroic, and they fight Artemis and his Emerald Claw agents, which are basically a little bit more powerful than bandits, I believe. We'll check out the stat block in a moment, but it is a big boss fight. You can see the adjusting encounter with just more of the agents. Some of you can max out Artemis's HP in case for higher levels. There is one little bit where he surrenders at the end if he makes it down to 15% hit points, and he just surrenders in front of the PCs, which is interesting because, most of the time when they're fighting monsters and things, everything fights to the death or just flees. But because you're fighting people, and this guy doesn't want to die, then he will just surrender and turn himself over to the authorities, and it mentions this is an action any character can do automatically upon announcement, which is executing him. It is encouraged that the characters debate the moral dilemma of executing a helpless person who wishes to be turned into the city's authorities, which is good because I feel like some people would be playing more chaotic rogues who are in it for the money, and some people are playing the lawful good paladins who are very much caring about people and the law and all of those things. So that could be make for a good kind of player debate at the end. So I think that's a nice bit of a conclusion. There's a nice little wild card element in case things are going very badly, or you just want to make things more interesting as a DM. The fact that when the players first got the schema, it defended itself by summoning these just robot things built from various scrap heaps kind of around the area, and it said during the fight the schema could do this. It senses violence around it, and it spawns 2 of those other creatures, which I would almost just do it just for funsies. I think even if one side was doing way better, regardless of trying to balance it out, I think that would just be a fun element to add to make things even more epic. Unless the players were just absolutely well, and if they were on their last legs, you could do that and have those things happen to attack Artemis and his gang. So I like that enough to where I would probably do that regardless of how the fight was going. I just think that's a neat thing to add. and that's the end. Like they recover the schema, they can turn it back into the professor and complete the mission. And there's a nice bit of falling action about the Bloody Spear character. That Warforged could be with them the entire time. Possibly, you could just have a NPC DM controlled ally, which could add a lot to the player's power. You can decide Arithmis's fate. A lot of this is, if you continue playing an Eberron, then those notes are in there. Stat blocks, there are definitely almost all unique creatures here, I think, in fact, which is pretty interesting. I mean, it's cool because this is Eberron. Like, this is a totally new world, so it's nice that we're not just fighting, goblins, and I guess we are fighting rats at one point, but it's nice to have some kind of differences, even though, like, the Agent of the Emerald Claw, okay, is essentially a bandit with slightly different abilities, but it's a CR1, for starters, with some other quirks about it. The Horrid Rat's just kind of a different kind of rat, I suppose. You've got the Warforged. I think there was an animated sword at one point, which is the Monster Manual. Yeah, and then there's the Shifter. And then the Zendrick Homunculus, which are the weird robots that are just built from other little robot things with like sword arms, which seem very cool. Interesting way of doing multi-attack, balancing multi-attack too, is it says it makes 2 attacks, but the second one is ruled with disadvantage, which I think is an effective way of balancing a multi-attack creature for lower level parties. And you've got maps. You've got really, really good maps here. I can definitely tell that the Elven Tower is a cartographer and very well versed in making maps, because we get some fantastic ones, some nice, they call them props. These are handouts. I especially love this one right here with the handout of this nice, it looks like a hand-drawn map. That's absolutely fantastic. So I really, really like what we're looking at here. I mean, it's a straightforward adventure. There's not a lot of twists and turns, except for I do like the twist that you think the adventure's over about halfway through, and then this big chase sequence happens that leads to like the actual second part of the adventure. So that's really cool, and I think it does effectively introduce elements of Eberron and Sharn via this really, really interesting city of just pure verticality, and the fact that it uses an air-based chase sequence is like the perfect way of showing off Sharn and showing off Eberron and why that is a cool place to explore. So let's go over my quick pros and cons for Sharn, the Missing Schema. At the top, please. So pro, I think there's an excellent amount of background information and lore on the city of Sharn. Maybe not Eberron in general, but I think that would be too much for the scope of an introductory adventure. If you really want to get into Eberron, there's material out there for you. But I think there's enough of Sharn here to really get a feel for this city and be able to effectively run an adventure within this city, which is the important takeaway. There is how did I write this? Variable informational rewards based on different DC skill checks. So that's, as I mentioned, like rolling those history checks in order to get more different kinds of information depending on how well you rolled. And it's not even that kind of adventure where the characters are trying to learn like actionable intel about something or someone. They're just getting background lore. So at that point, it's just kind of flavorful for the DM to be able to reward the players with what seems like even more information or older information that like really only scholars would know. If you rolled like an 18 or a 20 versus if you just rolled like a 10 or a 12, then you'll get kind of the basic information that everybody knows, which that can be a nice little factor in there, an extra treat for players. Pro, excellent formatting and use of art, maps, handouts, and flavor text. And we'll go through real quick because the artwork is amazing, but more than that, it's just the formatting. Like, look at how this page looks. You've got these little sidebar here, which looks lovely. The embedded maps. It's just a good use of using up the space. You can see the way everything's formatted with big, headings everywhere, very much like official published material, where I can easily find the information that I need. The flavor text up here in the different, the flowing script at the front of each chapter is absolutely amazing. So that all works really, really well. The only thing that looks a little weird is the fact that there's just so much of the dialogue that the DM is supposed to say that makes this look a little strange. Like, it would look better if this were like 2 or 3 paragraphs and kind of stopped there, but the fact that this takes up like more than half the page looks a little weird, and it speaks to the fact that the adventure is a little wordy when it comes to the DM just straight up talking to the players. But I get that it's setting up a lot of neat like things about Sharn that is very evocative and descriptive and provides a good visualization for players. Pro, adjustable encounters for levels 1 through 5. Every single hostile encounter says how to adjust it for 1 through 5. It is written as for level 1. So if you want to have it scaled for higher players, then you would just look on that adjustable encounter table. Or as an example, give me a fight. Right here. So yeah, level 2, you add 1 Horde Rat. Level 3, add 2 Horde Rats. Level 4, add 1 Horde Rat and 1 Long Tooth Shifter. So you just add more enemies to balance it out and essentially just make it more complicated. Or if your players, really like combat, they want to be challenged by it, you could always scale it up. Or your players don't particularly like combat, they're more in it for the story, you could always scale it down. So that's certainly an option. And final pro, I love the vehicle chase in the sky. That is very, very cool. It's a neat moment. It's a neat surprise moment that creates this, feeling of tension and shock when it happens, and then the way it plays out seems very interesting and fun, and is just a great way of showing off Eberron. Con, that being said, as a con, I feel like Part 3 needs just a bit more structure and information on how to run. Like the fact that I couldn't even find what the number was that they had to roll to not get knocked off. It just said an acrobatics check, which probably should be a dex saving throw, and maybe some kind of DC associated with that, so I know what they need to roll. And I would have preferred if it had specifically was okay, it takes place over 4 rounds, and here's what happens each round, and then give me a structure, and then the DM and the players can work around that, and the players can come up with things to do. I feel like it's just a little bit too open and too many options. I get that there's no map, I get that it's theater of the mind, I'm fine with that, but give me at least a round structure or some kind of way of framing it to where everybody can work through it and organize it. The other con is that the option to actually join the villain at the end, I mean, it's nice that that's an option, but it really isn't an option because it just kind of ends the adventure right there with no fight, which seems really lame and half-baked. I mean, it's nice to have a talkative villain, of course, that they can chat with and get information from, and that's there, but if the players do decide to join it, then there's really no consequence or anything of that nature. I guess they just don't get their reward at the end. It's just very anticlimactic and strange way to end the adventure, but otherwise those are the only cons. So my final verdict: straightforward and easy to run, Sharn the Missing Schema is the perfect introductory urban-based adventure into the world of Eberron. Thank you everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson and follow our own adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.